Maxine Hong Kingston's No Name Woman is a global story spanning continents in its setting, and it's a story of initiation and identity. Like Updike's A&P, it's a story to grow on. In fact, that's a phrase that Kingston uses in the story, one that widens for its protagonist and, for us, a greater understanding of the world, of moral complexities and paradox. Just as Sammy takes on a knight in shining armor myth, Kingston's little dog, as she is called, takes on the myth of Fa Mulan and shapes it into her own personal myth, an odyssey that begins with the stand-alone opening story, No Name Woman. This story is part of a collection called The Woman Warrior. There are 5 selections, and they cohere like a novel, but are autobiographical, as well as fictional, and based in the Chinese myth of the woman warrior, Fa Mulan. This represents more, that is, the collection of the kind of interlocking connectedness we find in short fiction that we spoke of before in conjunction with James Joyce's Dubliners or Isaac Babel's Red Cavalry, Ernest Hemingway's In Our Time. But Kingston weaves in autobiography as well as the Chinese myth, which she extends into her own personal sense of myth, which stirred some controversy. There was a Chinese-American short story writer and playwright by the name of Frank Chin who excoriated her for reshaping the Fa Mulan story to her own design and purposes. This myth, the Fa Mulan myth, goes back to ancient China from the 5th or the 6th century ballad of a woman warrior. There are a number of versions of the story, but Kingston changes it to suit her own personal and mythic odyssey as she blends her own first-person story with that of the woman warrior. And she creates this from legend as well as from feminist ideology. And there's even some Buddhism and other philosophy melded in. The legend, or the story, is essentially that of a young woman who fought for her people after spending years in the mountains with a wise old couple, and depending on the version, fought in place of her father or her brother and for the emperor, though in Kingston's version she fights against the emperor. The time with the old couple that she spends is a time of training in the martial arts, magic and enchantment, and also a good deal of suffering, but the attainment ultimately of higher levels of enlightenment. Disney made an animated feature based on the Fa Mulan story in 1998, and movies like Crouching Tiger and Hidden Dragon reflect some of its fantastical elements, an Ang Lee film. In one often remarked upon episode reminiscent of a story about the Buddha, the time that the young girl is spending with this couple, there is a rabbit that sacrifices itself by throwing itself into the fire. She's hungry and the rabbit can be eaten by her, but she doesn't want to eat the rabbit, and then the rabbit offers itself by throwing itself in the fire for her to eat, so that this famished woman warrior can eat. The training of the woman warrior for Kingston is rooted in learning the art of war and building character, but it's also linked to an anti-patriarchal view and a rejection of the notion of women as objects to be enslaved. Ancient China, and really up to modern China, had not only a very patriarchal society, but a society that was, well, male chauvinistic, wanted sons. I mean, a lot of this goes back to agriculture and to wanting sons to carry the work that was necessary for farming. But this was a culture that vested an immense amount of importance in the line or lineage that was carried on by boys. And girls were often regarded as really not very important compared to having sons. Daughters were not, that is, given the kind of importance that sons were. Quite the contrary. In fact, in many instances, as Kingston reveals in her work, girls were simply regarded as objects, to have their feet bound, to be in some cases almost sold like slaves, and indeed like slaves. Kingston would go on to write books that she believes were all part of one work, including a book called The Fifth Book of Peace. She had written a book called The Fourth Book of Peace, which was destroyed in a fire in her home in the Oakland Hills. It was the only manuscript she had. She tries to eventually lay out a vision for attaining peace rather than the war that's central to the woman warrior, and moves toward that with other novels that she wrote as well. But this book, which, as I said, has the unity of a novel, is certainly her most powerful work. She wanted to write a fiction, in other words, of peace. And it's, I suppose, ironic, you could say, that the fiction that has to do with warriors and with war has been much more compelling. The story No Name Woman is an extraordinarily compelling story. It's a prelude to this burgeoning sense of identity in the main character, who's known as Little Dog. And it plants us right in the nexus of old world Chinese traditions and the formation also of identity in a young Chinese American girl who's being told a secret story by her mother, a story she can't even let on to her father being made privy to, and one which her mother tells her she must never tell. It's essentially the story of her aunt in China who was effaced from memory, and as the title suggests, who has no name, who for all practical purposes, when she died, didn't exist any longer within family memory. The story is told to the girl by her mother as a warning. It's called a talk story, part of Chinese tradition and oral tradition. And it's of the girl's aunt becoming pregnant in China while her husband, like many of the husbands in the family's village, was away from the village working in Gold Mountain, which was the name the Chinese gave to America, a place where they felt, well, like many refugees, the streets were paved with gold or they could find gold. The villagers responded to the aunt's adultery by ransacking her family's home, killing their livestock, destroying their crops, and the aunt winds up giving birth in a pigsty and ultimately killing herself and the child by jumping in a well. This essential tragic story, of which I've given you the outline of, is told by the mother, but the daughter's voice is what gives us the story and her reaction to the story. She has her mother telling the story, but it's her imagining what actually were the reasons behind her aunt's transgressive behavior, and her mother explaining things that she didn't know about and imagining what might have happened as well. So it's as if the two of them come together in creating the story and to try to create a history out of fiction and out of their imaginations that bears some semblance of the truth, which to some extent reflects what the fictional creating process really is all about. The narrator tries to imagine what kind of man might have been responsible for the pregnancy and how also it relates to her, the story of her aunt, and to her identity. She imagines a number of men. She even imagines a man involved in the raid on the village, or a man leading the raid on the village, or a man forcing the aunt, or the aunt possibly being willing to go along with adultery, although it seemed to her, understanding her own culture at that time, that this was very unlikely. But all of this makes up the core of the tale. A tale that's told by the mother, Brave Orchid is what she's called, based on Kingston's own mother, who was a midwife in Canton before emigrating to the U.S. and settling with her husband in Stockton, California, where, in a story that unfortunately is not all that uncommon for immigrants, the husband, the brother of the no-name aunt in the story, had to leave his former station in life as a scholar and poet and become the operator of a laundry. This story to grow up on is a cautionary tale. It's similar in its mother-to-daughter narrative bond and its didactic purpose of keeping a young woman from premarital sex to a famous short fiction piece called Girl, written by Jamaica Kincaid, a West Indian fiction writer, which was published in 1978. And what's important to note here is that these ethnic writers, these women writers, are taking what was a long tradition of what were called wisdom tales, tales where fathers gave wisdom to sons or imparted some sense of what was necessary to know about life to their sons, through often a soliloquy or a monologue. But now you have mothers doing the same thing with daughters. The talk story of the mother in No Name Woman has, in addition to rich imagery, Chinese rhythm and cadences that one can hear in the mother's speech. I remember looking at your aunt one day when she and I were dressing. I had not noticed before that she had such a protruding melon of a stomach, but I did not think she's pregnant until she began to look like other pregnant women, her shirt pulling and the white tops of her black pants showing. She could not have been pregnant, you see, because her husband had been gone for years. No one said anything. We did not discuss it. In early summer, she was ready to have the child long after the time when it could have been possible. Now, the mother's voice is dominant here. She's the one who's telling the story. But we know that Little Dog, the daughter, is absorbing this story. And we know that the story is being told to her out of a sense of necessity on the mother's part, because she wants to communicate to her daughter what happened to the aunt, and what happened to the aunt should not happen to her. Little Dog must find her own voice. Her mother is certainly a model, but one of the central themes in The Woman Warrior, along with Little Dog's quest for discovering her cultural identity is discovering who she is, the nature of her voice, her identity. This is an important contemporary theme in short fiction, and kind of tracing it all along, talking about how important it is. And now we're right smack into it in The Woman Warrior. And the girl begins this story not only to tell, the mother begins the story not only to tell a story that she has said has never been told before, but the girl absorbs the story and tells it to us. She breaks the family code of silence and develops her own version of talk story to recast family, Chinese history, and combining with her mixed identity as a Chinese American. In addition to the mix of memoir, fiction, autobiography, and history, No Name Woman, like the rest of The Woman Warrior, is expository and combines both implicit and explicit politicizing. Like Grace Paley, Kingston was a peace activist. She protested the war in Vietnam and was arrested for her protest actions against the war in Iraq. It's mysterious in many ways as to why so many gifted writers tended to take positions that would normally be identified as being on the left. There are a few exceptions. Updike was somewhat conservative politically. Mark Halperin, who was a speechwriter, presidential speechwriter for Reagan and Bush. But for the most part, many of the writers who attain this kind of stature in short fiction, many of them were activists, and certainly many of them were on the left. No Name Woman has much connection to the rising level of feminist consciousness. It's another thing, perhaps, that Frank Chin found not necessarily all that tenable about The Woman Warrior, was the feminist consciousness in it. Little Dog makes the reader acutely aware of sexual politics and the gender inequities and misogynies and favoritism toward sons over daughters that existed in China. And here's No Name Woman, this first story, that provides so dramatic a view of what happens to a woman who's viewed as being morally transgressive. One could hardly call No Name Woman a feminist tract, though the rest of the work has strong feminist ideology in it. But it has strong elements of feminist didacticism coming from the voice of the daughter, Little Dog. And it clearly stirs up a kind of polemic against the oppressiveness of Chinese patriarchy. No Name Woman serves really as a dramatization of the inability, much of it linked to superstition, of Chinese villagers, like those in the story, to accept the transgressive act of this particular woman. Their wreaking punishment on the entire family is, from the standpoint of Brave Orchid's narrative, a collective act. The village had also been counting, she says, of the no-name aunt's pregnancy. And her mother warns Little Dog the villagers are watchful as she stresses to her daughter the real reason for this talk story: don't humiliate us. The villagers in this story represent one mind, like the sheep in the supermarket in Updike's A&P, or like the town people in Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. And what they want, we're told, is roundness. They want conformity that doesn't allow for self-expression, especially female self-expression, and that's where the didacticism comes into the story. The narrator's story and her identity as a woman are inextricably linked to the story of her no-name aunt. The Woman Warrior is essentially all about a search for identity, and this opening story serves as a stage setting for the whole collection. The mother has to imagine, through talk story, recreating her sister-in-law's pregnancy and death, giving us a kind of detailed account to her daughter. And her daughter, Little Dog, in turn, must use her own imagination to recreate the story of the aunt whom she calls her forerunner. And she decides that she too is complicit in keeping her aunt's story concealed, and concludes that unless she sees her aunt's life connecting to her own life, her aunt can give her what she calls no ancestral help. Thus her aunt becomes a haunting ghost, and the task of Little Dog is, in the words of the British psychoanalyst Winnicott, to make ghosts into ancestors. But it's also, of course, to find her own identity. The story we're talking about with the aunt takes place in 1924 in China, whereas the story we're being told is much more post-World War II in California. And it's told to the girl narrator just as she's beginning to menstruate. Menstruation obviously means that she too can have a child, and that's why her mother chooses that particular time to tell her this story. Feels that in spite of it going against her husband's wishes, in spite of the fact that her sister-in-law has no longer existed and been effaced from memory, she needs to tell her daughter that story. There's tension for the narrator resting on what to do with the skeletal facts of the story that she's told, how to absorb it into her own identity, how, in other words, can she merge Chinese tradition with America and what she calls its movie culture? That movie culture has to do, as you might imagine, with screen stars and with reading magazines like Screen Gems and with identifying with the movie stars that make up, well, our proud Babylon, the poet Carl Shapiro called Hollywood, or that Sargasso's Sea of Dreams, to quote the American novelist Nathaniel West about Hollywood. It's as if Hollywood is making American dreams about what female and feminine mean, and here's her mother telling her something really quite contradictory to that. How does she blend these? How does she bring these together? How does she synthesize them? This is, after all, a story about transgression and punishment that the narrator must make sense of in her own way and understand and interpret. And so she becomes imaginatively collaborative in the story of her aunt and understanding what occurred to her aunt. But we also are drawn in as readers, are part of the process. We become collaborative too, in terms of the meaning of the story, in terms of many of the mysteries that are not accounted for in the story. How the story is told, but even more so how it's interpreted. So, the aunt's story. Her husband went off to Gold Mountain. He was gone for a year before she became pregnant. And what happens as a result of her pregnancy is the villagers with white masks raid the aunt's family, pillage, they kill animals, they smear blood, they destroy and deface property. And of course, the aunt is essentially erased. Her own brother, the narrator's father, has done this. So the narrator is not only hearing the story, she's discovering an aunt she never knew of. And she's compelled to engage her own imagination in the construction of who this aunt was, to give her life, to give her what fiction ultimately tries to do, what our imaginations try to do through the reading of fiction, that is provide characters who cast real shadows. She has to make somehow a living creature of her aunt. The narrator, as I suggested before, concludes that adultery was probably an extravagance that women in China of a half century before wouldn't be able to choose for themselves. And she has all of these imaginative notions about the man who impregnated her aunt. Did he order her and she obeyed as a good Chinese woman dutifully would do? What kind of man was he? The narrator can't imagine her aunt having freedom with her own sexuality, yet she imaginatively hopes that this man may have been loved by her aunt. Maybe he wasn't just a TNA man. We see a whole dialectic going on in the narrator's own mind, not only about who her aunt was and what her aunt's motives were, but also of this phantom lover, what his motives were. She assumes that the aunt never divulged his name, the name of the man who got her pregnant, and that the villagers were acting out of lean times when food was scarce. Perhaps, we're told, if there had been less scarcity, the punishment would not have been so severe. And this brings us right back to the lottery and the idea that, not so much imagined like Shirley Jackson's story, although the narrator is imagining what must have taken place. Nevertheless, it was true that in lean times, there was much more of a willingness to scapegoat, to find someone who was going to be a victim of scapegoating or who would be punished, to release from the whole village what would have been called in Hamlet the hidden imposthume. You know, what made something rotten in Denmark. There was the idea, in other words, that her fertility, not coming from her husband, somehow was interfering with the fertility of growing crops, and therefore something had to be done to avenge or to appease the forces that made the crops grow. The girl also surmises that the child born to her aunt was probably a girl. We don't know that, but she imagines that. And she imagines her aunt's pain when she throws herself into the well and the stars in the firmament, and why her aunt originally went to the pigsty. So the narrator has a very integral stake in this story. She's trying to grow up. She's trying to grow up, to make herself American feminine, as she calls it, to think about how her aunt can serve her as a forerunner. She doesn't succeed in making her aunt her forerunner, and as I said, she ultimately even feels complicit, but this is all giving us the outlines and the shape of an identity, and of coming to grips with an identity that would eventually merge itself with the legend and the myth of Fa Mulan. The narrator reconstructs the story of a half-century of neglect as it was told to her 20 years before by her mother, and includes memories of her mother threading her and her sister's hairs into a bun with a depilatory string, telling them they were lucky not to have had their feet bound at age 7, as Chinese girls were traditionally had done to them. Yet she imagines her no-name aunt combing individuality into the bun of her hair. And it's combing that individuality, or having a sense of her own individuality, that she's really striving for. And a lot of that has to do with language. Little Dog is trying to understand her own history and her own identity through the aunt. And she recalls other odd facts from her personal history, such as her father trading for a girl and her lunatic grandfather putting his penis on the table. All sorts of things converge in her memory that will lead her toward, we assume, greater understanding of self. The story also represents the kinship that the village has in opposition to transgression and the consequences of, quote, the breaking of roundness, end quote, that become a lifetime lesson. Still integral to the narrator's consciousness as a woman and her increased awareness of her own personal, sexual, and ethnic identities. The narrator admits to her own participation in the aunt's punishment of rendering her to forgetfulness and oblivion. Yet paradoxically, she creates the story which gives her aunt life, a form of existence. The aunt and her child have, however, become ghosts, and superstition and tradition have continued to keep them ghosts. And in fact, when you read through The Woman Warrior, you begin to see how ghosts haunt the whole landscape of America, how people themselves become ghosts, living people, that is. This is a story that powerfully melds fiction and autobiography and reveals that indistinct and often indistinguishable territory that separates the two. But it also melds memory and imagination in ways that really reveal for us the consanguinity, that is, the closeness in blood of the two. I mean, in some respects, what we have in No Name Woman is a story that represents the fictional process. Not only the process of the formation of identity, but how fiction comes from material that's close at hand, autobiographical material, from memory, but has to be really based in the imagination, how the two have to fuse. That's what talk stories were, out of the ancient tradition in Chinese culture. And that's really what's taking place in this young girl. She's growing up, she's entering a different phase, she's just menstruated, but she's also moving into a different state of consciousness and a different awareness about how memories have to serve even when the memories have been effaced and no longer exist or aren't supposed to exist. She brings them back into existence because her mother introduces them, but she needs her imagination, and that becomes really the story. The story is remarkably evocative. Not only, by the way, evocative of a China of the distant past, which also has to be imagined by this girl, because she's American Chinese. She's grown up certainly using the Chinese language and being exposed to so many Chinese cultural things, but the distant past, 1920s, that she has to imagine. That takes a fictional imagination. But it's also a world that Kingston's portraying for us in which feminist consciousness and multicultural identity are breaking through. Kingston is quite able, through the distinctive voices of the mother and daughter in the story, to break some of the long-held stereotypes about the Chinese that are the legacy of post-colonialism, and to establish a cultural identity that would flower in some brilliant short fiction work of writers like Amy Tan, Jade Snow Wong, and Gish Jen, who were all strongly influenced by Kingston, and who all have written about mother-daughter relationships and the search for individual identity through cultural and feminist portals. Kingston is now a professor emeritus, was for many years a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, And she was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Clinton in 1997. The narrator in this story creates a personal and collective history that has strong autobiographical elements in it, but that ultimately links to her ethnic identity as a Chinese American woman, but also contributes in no small measure to the host of cross-cultural fiction writing that began to proliferate and to the rising significance of cross-cultural fiction. Now remember that although this is unmistakably autobiography, and it's hard in many instances to separate Brave Orchid and Little Dog from Maxine Hong Kingston's mother and Maxine Hong Kingston, nevertheless what's striking is the fact that she creates these characters, she creates these personas, as we've seen before in fiction. In short fiction, you need to blend often, as many of these writers do, autobiography in such a way that it's structured so that the autobiography becomes what we call fictive. It becomes imaginary. And in fact, you could argue that Kingston is doing something that is really between autobiography and fiction, because that's exactly what I believe it is. And when you get the blend of autobiography and fiction, you can move even into the realm of myth, or you can move into the realm of something quite different that's hybridized. Hybridization, imagination, reality, autobiography, fiction, is also seen in that sense of trying to come to terms with this hybridized identity. How much am I Chinese? Maxine Hong Kingston seems to be saying in this early story of hers in the collection. And how much am I American? How do I mediate between those two sides? Admittedly, I need my imagination to imagine what China's like, ancient China particularly, but even more recent 20th century China 50 years ago. And I can let my imagination roam and capture some of that. But I still feel Chinese. The language makes me Chinese. My parents and the stories they tell, the talk stories they tell, makes me Chinese. All of this, the way I look and see myself in the mirror, but I'm American. And how, again, that film culture that she's bred on, that she identifies with perhaps even more than she does the talk stories, how does she strike the balance or find some kind of synthesis between those two strong pulls to her identity? And they are unequivocally strong in different directions. It becomes a question, really, that we identify with a lot of ethnic writing. And we see it in the more widespread ethnic writing that occurs in this era that has to do especially with hybridized identity. We see it, for example, in a number of Indian American writers, that is, Native American writers, like Sherman Alexis, or Leslie Marmon Silko, or from South India, like Bharati Mukherjee or Jhumpa Lahiri. We see it in a lot of Mexican American writers, like Maria Viramontes and Sandra Cisneros. There's this whole sense of trying to come to grips with ethnic identity, but it takes us back to the origins of the ethnic identity, and it becomes, in some ways, cosmopolitan. That is, takes us back to the country of origin, as well as its culture. And this, combined with the kind of feminist consciousness that we see in a story like Maxine Hong Kingston's No Name Woman, moves us to a lot more contemporary fiction, and a lot more contemporary fiction concerned with identity, whether it's hybridized ethnic identity or whether it's the identity of simply being a woman. This is where we move in the contemporary vein. And where we move next, as far as this course of ours and the lectures, is to a writer who's called a metafiction writer. Contemporary in her search for identity, contemporary in her feminism, Canadian, and a writer who is also distinguished not only as a short story writer, but also as a novelist. Next, a story called, if you believe in such things, Happy Endings. And the novelist and short story writer, author of Happy Endings, Margaret Atwood.